רק מילה בעברית חודרת, אלוקיי אל נשמתי, בגוף כואב, בלב רעב, כאן הוא ביתי. לא אשתוק כי ארצי שינתה את פניה, לא אוותר להזכיר לה ואשיר כאן באוזניה עד שתפתח את עיניה. אין לי ארץ אחרת עד שתחדש ימיה, עד שתפתח את עיניה. אין לי ארץ אחרת, גם אם אדמתי בוערת, רק מילה בעברית חודרת, אלוקיי אל נשמתי, בגוף כואב, בלב רעב, כאן הוא ביתי. בגוף כואב, בלב רעב, כאן הוא ביתי. שתפתח את עיניה.
מברוק. שוקרן ימישה. חג שמח.
חג שמח.
פורים שמח. Shalom, friends. Rabbi Misha Shulman, my dear friend and talented musician and singer, got us going this evening. I'm Amichai at my home here in Harlem with the Lab Shul. Rabbi Misha is with many of you here from the new Shul, between the Lab Shul and the new Shul, and our long history of being friends and often working together. And Misha and I being friends and colleagues, and both of us finding ourselves in a lot of public squares in these past years, and certainly these past months, standing with our family and friends in Israel, with solidarity with what's going on there. We thought it would be a good idea for us to come together, to start with singing. We'll talk about the auspiciousness of this date in a moment, and to share with you all some thoughts. We're no experts, but about what's going on right now in Israel and in Palestine, how this has impact on our lives, and open it for some questions and conversations. This is not a very well-planned or deeply thought-out program. This is a conversation. It's making life makes it possible on Zoom for us to all sit in our living rooms on a Tuesday evening. But I also want us to imagine we're all sitting in a circle together, many of us getting to know each other, maybe for the first time. So welcome on this Purim day. Thank you for inviting us into your homes and into your hearts.
Shalom, everybody. Erev Tov. I'm here in Brooklyn and Kensington, and this is I hope a useful thing for all of you this evening. I know that it's useful for me and for Amichai. We have these are like very emotional times for us Israelis and all the Israelis that I'm speaking to. we're emotional a lot of the time these days, more than usual, I would say. And so a lot of this is really for you, but I really do feel like, that kind of sharing for Amichai and me to kind of explain what is it that's making us so moved these days, and to share that with you guys. So thank you for being here and joining in this conversation with us.
Amen. So there are 55 of us and more coming in from different communities and others. We'd like to take a moment as we start to ask you all to, wherever you are, however your day has been, was it Purim? Was it not so Purim? Are you with a hangover? Is it just a work day? Take a moment, find your way to be grounded with your feet on the ground, maybe with a leftover hamantashen and in front of you or a drink. Let's ground ourselves in the privilege of taking some minutes to be involved in the sacred conversation. On this holy day, where sacred conversations is part of the invitation. Taking the masks off, looking inside. As we begin, both Misha and myself are just going to share a few thoughts and reflections briefly, and then talk a little bit about current events. And then we're going to open it up for questions. Knowing that if you're here, we're assuming that you care about Israel, you care about Palestine, you care about the fate of people and our people and all people, and you want to know more, and you're perhaps concerned about what is going on and what can be done better, how we each can help. But we don't want to assume. So what I'd like us to do for the next minute or so, if you have an intention that brings you here tonight, a curiosity, a thought, maybe a question, and let's put those in the chat. Let's just, and feel free to just hold your own heart with what brings you here tonight. There's so many ways to spend a Tuesday evening at the edge of Purim. So please take the moment to use the chat, and let's just see some intentions, questions, a word, a sentence, what brings you here tonight. And then we can all focus together with love and concern, do some talking together. So thank you, Lucy, for getting started, wanting peace in the world, especially in Israel. It's a wonderful hope and intention to support peace and democracy in Israel and Palestine, to know more. Thank you, Carol.
Amen. Worry for Israel, feeling far away. I'm with you on that. To find out what we in the US can do to help the situation always.
Yeah. Very good question there. Where is the Palestinian lens in these protests? We're going to talk about that. Very important question. What can we do to make a difference, to be together, the community that cares about Jews and Palestinians alike? Thank you, Roberta, for your work on this. From Oxan, is there any chance that Netanyahu will give in to justice-thinking Israelis? Being in community.
Someone wrote about hope. I think that's an underlying reason for many of us here.
Mm-hmm.
We're curious about hope. We'll talk about that too.
Mm-hmm. Learn more how we can help galvanize to support both work for justice in Palestine and Israel, concerned about totalitarianism in Israel and around the world, looking for reasons for hope. Indeed, support the protesters, me among friends, share heartbreak, dialogue, community. What can we do about pressure? Why does justice seem so fragile? I guess that's a question we can flag year round.
Amy's wondering about how Israel could be a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
That's on our minds. That's what this is about. This is exactly what this is about. Whether it can, how it can, seeing and feeling pain. Yeah. And then Andrea is saying to gain information. I think that's very important right now.
Yeah, what can we do? Celebrate the bravery of the protesters who are nonviolent but disruptive. Thank you, Todd. An important difference. Talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion ideation to Israel. How do we introduce that there more?
Forcing yourself to tune in, says Erica. I think we all do. I do that most days.
The fear of Israel falling apart because of this, and more. So thank you all. If you've already put it in, if not, just take another moment. This is for us to really articulate where we are on this day. And I just want to say, as we're starting, we're only going to be here for an hour total. We're not going to raise it all. We're not going to touch it all. We might be triggered and triggering. We might be hurt and hurting. It's not our intention. I will speak for myself, but I think Misha feels the same. We are from Israel. We love Israel. We have care and concern for Israel. We're also deeply invested in the justice, freedom, the liberation of the Palestinian people, and it's a both and enterprise. And so we come to that, to these communities and to our work. And we know that there are third rails left and right on these conversations. So we don't want to be afraid, but we want to also tread lightly in this, maybe one of many conversations. So, yeah, as more of your important questions and intentions come in. So let's pause for a moment. I want to share with you just a few moments about today's significance. And for those of you who are not in the room right now, but are watching this recording afterwards, again, we hope this will be a helpful tool for making perspective. So here in New York City, it's just after 7 p.m. on Tuesday night. The holiday of Purim is pretty much over here in New York. In Israel right now, Shushan Purim, the second day of Purim, only observed in Jerusalem and some other communities, is still taking place, which means we're not out of concern for riots, for violence, for particular acts of terror, particularly from fundamentalist Jewish settlers who are using the holiday of Purim with its messages of survival and fear and our historical terror to inflict such on others. And there's already been such a couple of incidents yesterday in Hawara, in Jenin. And I want to tell you about something that happened back in 1994 that many of you know about. Purim, when I was in my 20s living in Jerusalem, that has a lot to do with why we're meeting today on Purim and why Misha and I thought it would be important to meet on this day. Back in 1994, Purim morning in Jerusalem started off as just another Purim. The night before, I think, my first official drag at the pub I co-ran in Jerusalem. We're going to have a big party that day, but news came in that a settler by the name of Baruch Goldstein, a Brooklyn-born doctor living in Kiryat Arba near Hebron, went to the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of the ancestors, with his gun and in uniform, and opened fire in the section where Muslims pray. 29 Muslims, men praying, Palestinians were shot dead and hundreds were wounded. And Goldstein was killed within minutes with the blows of the survivors. He left a suicide note before he left his home, in which he quotes the scroll of Esther and the messaging that have to do with the fact that in the scroll of Esther, there's a plot to kill the Jews and the Jews survive, and in self-defense or in revenge, they go out and slaughter Persians of high numbers, and there's this cycle of violence that is part of the Purim story with the other and the groggers and the fear and the hatred. And because of that, which is so much part of the narrative of the Jewish people, even though this is the demon and a skeleton we don't usually let out of the shadows, Goldstein brought it out. And that story was obviously on everybody's minds and hearts for days and weeks and months to come. And for me, it changed Purim completely. It wasn't just about fun and masks and drag and upside down, but actually it was about the collective shadow of the Purim story, of the Jewish shadow story, the Israeli-Palestinian story. Purim was never the same. This is, of course, not an isolated incident. It sits in the context of a huge Palestinian terror attack in Tel Aviv following Purim. The violence around this story of us and them, and after thousands, hundreds of years of Jewish diaspora, where the Purim story was developed as a fantasy of power, the reality in Israel since the 1940s is that it's not a fantasy of power anymore. We're not a minority. We're now an army and a nation and a strong entity with responsibility. And those Purim haha stories about fantasies of power are not so fantasies anymore. And Goldstein became a warning sign for the fundamentalistic translation of Jewish life and Jewish values in Israel and beyond. There was a young Israeli man by the name of Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was a young racist Jew in the Kahana movement, who at some point in the late 90s got dressed up on Purim as Baruch Goldstein. Photos of Itamar Ben-Gvir dressed up as Baruch Goldstein, blessed be Baruch, a mass murderer, circulated online the last few days because, of course, now Ben-Gvir is the Minister of National Defense, what used to be called the police, but is now a national defense force. So we are concerned that there are lots of people on the right side, on the right, ultra-right side of Judaism who represent some, but certainly not of all our Jewish values, who are now in control, who are now in power, who are giving inspiration to people who might not share exactly our Jewish values and are rioting perhaps today and tomorrow still as echoing of that story. So Purim has that in its skeleton closet, and that's part of what we do when we have a drink too many and take off our masks and talk about it. And however, New Shul celebrated Purim on Sunday night and Lab Shul last night with some parodies and satire. We do or we don't go there. But Purim Day is when we have a seudah, a feast or a conversation, and we sit down and we get to talk about some things. So that's why Misha and I wanted to talk about this with you today. It's the end of the day, so we're not in full-on party mode, but I'm finishing the very end of my afternoon drink here and hydrating equally and with a heavy heart, but with the gratitude of being in community with my brother Misha and with you all to have this honest conversation about what's going on here so we can be more present and helpful. So that's my context. And Misha, I want to hand it over to your context and personal take here.
Toda Amichai. Yeah. I remember that. I remember the day after. I don't remember the day on which Goldstein did it, since you're bringing it up. But I remember the day after, which was I was in 9th grade at the time, going to also Jerusalem, the Masorati High School, and what I remember is the conversation we had with our teacher about what had happened, and everybody's dismay. And mostly I remember this one kid who just unabashedly supported what Goldstein had done. And nobody agreed with him, of course, but it was there. And so this stuff, this pogrom that happened last week in Hawara, right? Which I'm assuming people know about. These Jewish settlers went in there to avenge these two settlers, young settlers who were murdered the day before, and the way they chose to do that and to express their pain was to burn up a village. It was a proper pogrom. And so, that's the line. That's the line that we're talking about. And I think one of the things that's really interesting right now, it's interesting to us Israelis who are, deep in it. And I think it's also interesting to folks here who are trying to figure out what's happening over there, is this question of what's new here and what's not. What do we already know? Because the temptation with Israel, it's such a mess all the time, is to kind of say, well, it's always a mess over there. So why should I don't exactly understand, right? That's what I'm getting from some people. I don't exactly understand what's different right now. How is this, right? So part of my process has been thinking about what's new. What have I not seen? In my 21 years living in Israel, in my 3 years in the army, in my years of going back there and living here, what have I not seen, and what actually have I seen many times before? And actually, this is an obvious, manifestation of what always was. These are some of the questions, and so I'm thrown back to these ceremonies in high school, in which we would on Yom HaZikaron, on the Memorial Day for Soldiers, when we would sing Hatikva, and many other occasions, right? Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, which means, right? Somebody asked about hope, right? It means the hope. This is the symbol of the Jewish state, of the Israeli state. We sing Od lo avda tikvateinu, right? Our hope has not been lost yet. Our hope of 2,000 years, and what is our hope? Liot am chofshi be'artzenu, to be a free people in our homeland. Yeah, that's our hope. Now, this question of free is really interesting in terms of old or new, right? Because we know that Israel is a democracy. We say that, but democracy implies freedom, and there's a question about whether that freedom has existed. And the truth is that we also know that Israel has never been a democracy for everyone since its very beginning. It was as democratic as the Jews felt they could allow, I would say, right? But from 1948 until 1970, all of the Arab citizens of Israel lived under military law. They had no rights. These are the Arab citizens of Israel. And before that ended in 1970, came 1967, in which there was the occupation. The occupation began, right? The 6-Day War, and then the occupation of the territories. And since then, we haven't given rights to all of those people, all of those people, millions of people who have no rights. And so this hope for being a free people, right? We can't be free until everybody's free, right? And that's something that you learn as an Israeli, when there's a knifing in your neighborhood, or in my 20s, when I'm suddenly going out, into the territories for the first time to meet Palestinians and see how they live, right? And feeling the tremendous anxiety, shame, pain, desire for something different, that it's not freedom. It's not a free people, right? And it's not exactly a democracy. So this stuff that happened, this pogrom and this Baruch Goldstein, there's a line that goes straight from the beginning of the country all the way to here. So all of that, in a way, there's the struggle around democracy, and a Jewish democracy, that strange phrase from the Declaration of Independence, that's always been there. This question has always been there. But what's new? I'll tell you what I feel is new right now. Amichai, you can also chime in, but my feeling is that in my entire life, I have never seen the people rise up in the way that Jewish Israelis are now rising up. I've never seen it, not here. And I've been to many protests, here, and there, I've heard from, the Lebanon war, about those massive protests. I've heard about all those things, but this is bigger, and this is of a different scale. So that's something that's new. And then there's one other thing that is striking me. And actually, I'll say one more word about that, right? Why is everybody going crazy? Why is everybody out in the streets? Well, Amichai and I will kind of lay out some of the practical pieces of this, this legal, I don't know what to call it, revolution or whatever it is. We'll lay out some of the practical things so that we're all on the same page about it. But what it amounts to is tremendous anxiety. When I had two conversations this week with Israelis, one of whom I said to him, I imagine that, even 40 years from now, I'll be 85 years old and I'll go fly to Israel to visit my brothers. And he laughed and said, I don't think so. And the next day I had another conversation with one of the teachers at the school, and he said, no, I think 10, 20 years and it's finished. Yeah. So that's also kind of new but because of this anxiety, we're really pushed out there, right? And people feel like they're fighting for their survival. They're really fighting for their survival. One last thing I'll say before I pass back to Amichai is that I think might be new. And this comes from my father. My father is a peace activist, longtime peace activist. He's American born, made Aliyah in 1967 out of, Zionist and Jewish fervor, went there, and pretty much since he got there and his big disappointment at everything that he saw, he became a deeply devoted peace activist. And just this last Friday, him along with probably around 400 left-wing activists went to Hawara, this village in the West Bank, where that was attacked, in which one person was killed and many injured, and homes burned and hundreds of cars burned and things like that. And they went there just to show solidarity. And it was very hard to get there because the army wouldn't let them in. But what he described that sounds new to me is that the following evening, in the demonstration in Jerusalem in front of the president's house, the chant that people were chanting at the security forces who were there, controlling the demonstration, was "Efo haitem bechawara." Where were you in Chawara? Yeah, where were you? In other words, this realization that the connection between the Israeli majority's, anxiety and fear and what's happening in the West Bank is somehow coming together. And that, if you're asking about hope, there is hope there. For me, there is hope, and that's kind of new. And there's hope that the liberal majority, and there still exists a liberal majority in Israel between the Jews and the Arabs, but that the liberal majority, the Jews and the Arabs, will come together meaningfully. So that to me, it hasn't happened yet. I don't want to give you any false, but we are seeing little things that feel new to some of us. I'll give it back to you, Amichai.
Thank you, Misha. So that was a lot. Thank you for sharing both the questions about how long this situation has been brewing, the notion of hatikva, the hope, and the question of ma nishtana, what's new, right? We're 1 month away from Seder. What's new? So I want to say three short things, and then we're going to open it up. How did we get here? So we alluded to this, and again, I'm sure you've read the news. There's plenty out there. Times had a piece this morning on the cover. Back in early January, the current government was sworn in. Netanyahu won by something like a 30,000 vote majority. It's not a lot. Over a very tight race between different parties. The Israeli parliament system is its own issue. And he built a coalition with the most ultra-right forces, some parties that were not admissible into the Knesset, into the parliament a couple of terms ago. including the most ultra-right and the most religiously and politically. Some of those voices abhorrently from anti-Palestinian and racist, misogynist, and homophobic were introduced to very key positions. And of course, what's at the heart of it is that Netanyahu has been indicted, is on trial for several important cases, and this has been a bureaucratic nightmare of trying to get him indicted in proper law, not very different than what might be happening here, et cetera, et cetera. I was in Israel, in Jerusalem, where the government was sworn in on January 2nd. Like Misha said, there had never been in Israel such a wave of protests on the day a government is sworn in democratically. And outside the Knesset, there were thousands of people, old, young, religious, secular, Palestinian flags, rainbow flags, the sign we both have behind us, the fear of democracy being demoralized and decimated, because that was clearly the agenda of some of the people who walked into Bibi's government. Later that afternoon, I was driving and I heard the speech of the spokesman of the Knesset, the new head of the Knesset, Amir Ohana from the Likud party, from Bibi's party, who is an openly gay man. He's the first openly gay man to be not only a prominent member of the Israeli parliament, but the chairman of the parliament. And he's very right-wing, and he's a Netanyahu man, and he made a beautiful speech that made me sob. But yes, here he is, a first openly gay man, and here's his husband in the thing, and his parents who moved from Morocco and made it in Israel, and his commitment to all the values, and not a single queer kid will be hurt under his watch. And this is the same man who was there when the coalition was sworn in, with all the stipulations that LGBT organizations will be, if not outlawed, then definitely unbudgeted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very complicated moment. That day was a complicated moment, all the protests and then this. And then we wanted to see what's going to happen. And within a month, it was very apparent what's happening, with a very quick slate of reforms or laws that initially are there to challenge the independence of the Supreme Court of Israel and its own judicial system, and basically put a lot of the power in the hands of the governing force of the country, whether that's this current government or another one. So whatever checks and balances are there, will be very, very much challenged with the authority of the political party in charge. And that is from the playbook of Hungary and Poland and Brazil and some of the Trump voice. Like, we know these playbooks, and they are not interested in liberal democratic as much as in centralized power. In this case, they're combined with the halakha, with Jewish law, which is very much on the right, more ultra-Orthodox way of things. And it's certainly anti-occupation and anti-left and anti-human rights in ways that simply manages to look at one aspect of Judaism. And I'm seeing your questions about Jewish revenge and Jewish power. Yes, we have many voices. We are a people of thousands of years and multiple approaches, and some have prevailed and some are prevailing. And now that Israel has power and there's no separation of religion and state, the religious force that is now in charge is the one that is really the most extreme and is going very quickly about passing some laws and avoiding calls from the Israeli president and many, many leaders worldwide, political leaders, financial leaders, high-tech leaders, artistic leaders, people in the United States, prominent Israelis, the military, to stop and have hidabrut, have conversation, and not just pass these legislation that will completely truncate democracy even further. So people have been protesting since that first day of the government was sworn in, and it's been growing and growing and growing. Absent from the protests are ultra-Orthodox Jews for the most part, and Palestinians, and Israelis who are Palestinian, Muslim, Christian, who are Israeli citizens. Some are, mostly are not. And so the question of like, how big is the occupation as the reason for this moment of the claim, and how Israelis who've not wanted to deal with it before are not dealing with it now, is a big question, as Misha said. I'll just give you one illustration. In the last 6 weeks, almost every Sunday, there's been protests in Washington Square Park, organized very organically by mostly Israelis and former Israelis all over the United States. There are similar protests in San Francisco and Boston and DC and Chicago. And I've been to quite a few. Misha has been to a few. We've been together. And there's like a debate over, can we have Palestinian flags there to say we support Palestinian freedom and dignity and the occupation. A lot of the hardcore Israelis don't want a Palestinian flag because this is a moment where Israelis who've never stood together are trying to stand together and fight against the right in ways they have not before. This is new in the power, in the numbers, in the growth of this movement. So on the day, one of the Sundays a few weeks ago, there were a couple of friends of ours who were holding both Palestinian and Israeli flags, and there were Israelis with just Israeli flag. It got ugly, violent verbally, thankfully not physically, and the protest kind of disintegrated. And this is the same conversation in Israel, where we're trying to figure out how to integrate the different calls towards change and towards democracy, save Israeli democracy. And as Misha said, can this be a moment that really pushes through these factions and gets more people to stand together? And will that include more Palestinians who can vote in Israel? And will this grow bigger? There was an article in the Haaretz this morning in Hebrew. It's probably going to come out in English in a couple of days from Uri Misgav that says this is the Intifada of now. This is the Israeli Intifada. Intifada is an Arabic word that says uprising. And can it grow to really encompass everybody and demand the changes we need? So this is part of where we are right now. The protests are continuing. This coming Thursday will be another big day of Israeli protests and strikes. The team that is on the Netanyahu government, Levin, Rotman, are moving ahead. We're trying to pass these votes in a parliament that has a majority of their party, of their coalition. It's a little bit like what happens here in the House and the Senate when you just don't have the majority. And there are hopes, and so that some of your questions, that Netanyahu and some of his people, with a lot of pressure from the Israelis who are protesting, from top people in all fields, from world leaders, to say, you got to stop before this deteriorates into votes that can, with great difficulty, be taken, can be changed, and with a rift, the deep rift inside Israeli and Jewish society. There's more to say about this rift. This is not new, as Misha said. It's only being exposed in a deep, deep way. And between the demographics and the political reality, we might be looking at two different societies. And there's historical precedent for that. And we might be looking at people with radically different views of how to be Jewish and how to be alive, and what does power mean, and what does land mean. And can we create a coalition that will transcend some of these differences and make sure that more people live and less people are hurt, and we build a greater reality?
It's really, one way to think about what we're fighting about here is we're fighting about what it means to be Jewish. That's one way to think about it. Is it looking at us inwardly and protecting, or is it about opening up? And I don't mean to even denigrate that fact. We have real reason to shut ourselves in. We all have stories in each of our families about that make us want to do that. But it's a real question. What's it for, being Jewish, and this state that we have, this nation state? It plays a lot into that, right? Like I'm listening to myself and to Amichai speak and wondering what this sounds like to American ears, and the temptation, I think, for a lot of people in this country is to kind of say, okay, it's crazy, and I give up. It's too difficult. It's too hard, and yet here, it's managing to get even harder and more difficult. But the truth is that we have no way out of it. In the school, we have this school that we run, the School for Creative Judaism. It's a kind of Hebrew school, and we deal with this question of Israel and Palestine. And we occasionally bring together the teachers who are all Israeli and New Yorkers. And we talk about, how should we teach this conflict? What are we supposed to teach about this place? And there's all kinds of different people, but one of the voices that consistently comes up is we shouldn't teach. We shouldn't teach about it. And my response has always been, and is to this day, we should definitely teach about it. And not only because it's who we are, but also because if we don't, we relinquish the playing field, and then they're going to get to find themselves in college, and somebody else is going to come and tell them what to think about that. Not that we tell them what to think, but we want to maintain. But it has to do with it's our religious education, really. These questions go to the core of our faith and our questions of who are we, who we are, and that's why. And it plays out in the world in these even in these demographic ways, right? You can think about what are the demographics of Israel, right? It recently came out that the Israeli government thinks that in 2050, that's 27 years away, it's not very far. In 2050, 1 out of 3 Jewish Israelis is going to be ultra-Orthodox. And that, there's going to be, and 1 out of 4 Israeli citizens is going to be ultra-Orthodox. So imagine the kind of society these rifts are just going to become more and more intense. And that's another reason why for me, it's like, well, we just have to find the populations over there that are going to join together, for this kind of vision of what kind of world, what kind of faith, what kind of place we want to be.
Yeah. Thank you, Misha. I want to say briefly just to a few of your questions now. Yes, there are certainly Jews across the spectrum of orthodoxy who are challenging this particular government and some of its coalition partners. And like Misha said, this is an argument not just about a political form, democracy, all its contents and discontents, but over religious identity and the forms of religious identity, and where does plurality and fluidity come into it versus a much more orthodox approach. So it's certainly about that, and as it's related to the politics. Sort of the question on a lot of people's minds right now is, what's the long game and how can we be helpful? So I think one of the reasons we're here tonight is to first of all begin having the conversation. We're certainly working with several organizations such as the New Israel Fund to be constantly informed and be helpful on the ground to organizations and to individuals and to people that are helping this information flow freely and help support this movement. We're going to share some information about this ongoing protest in New York City, and about other ways in which we can be doing work in our communities together in the months ahead, and in support of others. I'm seeing some great information coming in the chat, and there are more opportunities that maybe we can join with other communities and other groups that do together. But tonight was less about let's get all action oriented. Let's just focus in head and heart where we are with what's beginning to make sense of what's happening. For some of you, this might be the 50th conversation on this. For some of you, this might be the first. We're not all on the same page here, and there's a lot of conflicting information. So we will share more, and we will share some links after tonight. I think as we are nearing the last 15 minutes of this hour, we wanted to open it up for some questions. I want you to be mindful of the fact that there are lots of people here. So think about a question you want to ask that might be relevant to more of us. And please remember that a question ends with a question mark, if possible. And again, we're no experts. We're just in it. and we care, and we know you do too, and we want to be listening to each other and hold the space with care. So if anybody has a question, either free put it in the chat or unmute, and let's hear each other with open hearts.
Yeah, Roberta, you got your hand up?
Yeah, thank you so
Hi,
much.
Roberta.
I'm just so grateful that for the two of you and all of us here together. My question is, why do the two of you, what is your understanding of why it seems so hard for Israelis to connect the dots between the loss of democracy and the occupation? It's really hard, I think, for so many of us to really understand. Is it racism? Is it, yeah. What is your,
I mean, I'll give you my quick answer, and it has to do with white supremacy, and it has to do with the white supremacy culture that we now in the United States know so much more about than we did in previous years, and how so many different people, past and present, preferred not to look at what made America rich and what makes America prosper, and at what cost. Israel, as Misha said, is dealing with the notion of who's who and who matters, and Jewish and democratic tension since before 1948. And it's been the case since, and it's been increasingly the case. And many, many Israelis prefer not to look at the factors of what makes it a prosperous country. What is not the cost, but the benefit of the occupation financially. And there are religious, political, economic tensions that people prefer not to look at. And part of what this protest is doing slowly and complicatedly is unraveling some of the blind spots. And there are more and more calls to understand what's going on here, and it's complicated. Like here, Israel is split between people with very different opinions about what does it mean to be an American or Israelis, what are religious values, civil value, human values. And the sheer size and breadth of his protest is already so surprising for the good of its growth. So it's hard to know where it's going to go. It will likely splinter over the demand to put the Palestinian occupation at its center.
I'll just add one quick thing. After this protest that Amichai described, in which we were both at Washington Square Park, and someone came for Palestinian flag, everybody started yelling at him, and it was horrible. I described that whole scene to my brother, who lives in Israel, professor at Hebrew University. He's dealing with this stuff, and he's out there protesting every Saturday night now. But I wouldn't, he's not like he's a bit more towards the center than I am, for example, at least on Israeli stuff. So I asked him about that, and his answer was these protests are, it's the Jews' protest, and that is exactly, the mentality behind that is the same mentality from 1948. This is what we are here to protect the Jews, and those who are not Jews, they're not what we're thinking about. And so this is a long-standing, it's been in the education, but it's deep in the ethos of this country. And so breaking that, or chipping away at that, finding collaborations, the previous government finally had an Arab party in the government. Oh my God, right? Breaking those things are very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sarah Mullins, I'm seeing you raise your hand, so it'd be great to hear from you. Just before I call on you, I saw a question here from Neil. Where do we see signs of people coming together in new ways beyond the diverse? In many ways, Neil, they are. My friend Rabbi Tamar Elad Applebaum wrote about how she stood in front of the president's house in Jerusalem, with thousands of people now go. It's been growing from hundreds. And she turns about and she sees her parents in the crowd. and they're in their 80s, like classic Israeli builders of the country. They would never have gone protesting, but enough is enough. And that's true for some Haredi ultra-Orthodox, for some of my Israeli Palestinian friends in Haifa who've been coming to the demonstrations despite the complexity of being a Palestinian in those protests. My 93-year-old mother showed up to one of the protests last week. We're like, very well, Mom, don't go, because they've been getting violent. But she sort of just went briefly. She was like, I must. So that was unheard of. So not to use my mother as the example for the triumph of this protest, but people are speaking up. They understand that this is really very much at the stake of everything, and it's growing steadily. Again,
including some right-wing people.
Yes, absolutely. Who are understanding this is not about right or left. This is about deeper issues. Sarah.
I think it's just important to say that the majority of Israelis are against this. It's about, in polls, it's about 60%, right? So it's the government is not really representing the majority in this case.
Yeah. Sarah.
Hi.
Hi.
I apologize if this was touched on before I got home to get on the Zoom, but I'm interested in your recommendations for language. One of the things that's been difficult for me with this is I appreciate the language around the protests in Washington Square Park are pro-Israeli democracy. But we're seeing with the rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, students at Hillel, secular Jewish students are being targeted by pro-Palestinian groups when they're not the right target. How can we be pro two-state solution, pro-democracy, pro-human rights for everybody, but sensitive to the fact that it's sometimes it does cross a line when we're in this weird time with the rise in anti-Semitism? What's the best language?
The best language is nuance, and it doesn't help on an Instagram post. And unfortunately, some of the violence and the bullying that we're seeing online, and that's growing, and trolls left and right, and that happens in the squares, is about impatience for nuance. So, some of the people who attacked, when Misha and I were there, and ever since in the ongoing conversation about having the Palestinian conversation as part of these protests, is that we are giving anti-Semites tools to attack us by supporting Palestine or by supporting Palestinian freedom, and that we are exposing Israel's vulnerability, and we're showing the dirty laundry. And so the language is just like the language when Trump was president, and we as proud Americans said, we love America. We don't love this president. We support the American values. We don't support these policies. We love Israel. We support Israel's right to exist. We want Palestinians to exist, and we want this government to not do what it's doing, and if possible, to be replaced. So it's this, right? It's a little nuanced. And yes, of course, there are anti-Semites. And this is not helping. But the idea is to focus on what we're focusing on. It's not incidental that democracy, the word that both Misha and I have behind us, Arabic, Hebrew, and English, became the rallying call of this protest, because that is something that most of us, not all of us, can get behind. And Israel is closely losing some of its democratic holding. So I hear you. It's complicated. Language is complicated.
Yeah, it's been hard. I tried to talk about that nuance, but with my non-Jewish friends, it's been difficult, as someone who shares their politics, who's very politically active, is known as liberal, and then, seeing them saying or posting things that the language can get a little scary.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why nuance, unfortunately, needs to be brought in as carefully as we can, and maybe we can together think of more language. There's a lot out there. So in the chat, there's important links to organizations and voices. Both Misha and I and our congregations are part of many such affiliations, and maybe out of this call, we'll take the various links, make sure we're all on the same page.
I do want to say one thing about about your question, Sarah. this isn't exactly an answer to your question, but there's a defensive stance that takes place when we're attacked around these anti-Semitic kind of things, that we instinctively, myself as well, we kind of wear them, right? They creep up and then they're there. But at the same time, we also have to remember who the real victims are in these situations, and yes, on the college campuses and whatever, these situations you're describing, definitely, these people who are being treated in these ways are the victims. But over there, the Palestinians are so deeply victimized. It's victimization, over victimization. It keeps getting smeared all over them, and they really can't stand it. And they're right. And so when people come out in these ways that can go overboard and can be wrong, part of what they're trying to say is, think about that, put that it's somewhere in your consciousness and show it to us. And so I don't know exactly the language. I think Amichai's right. Nuance is exactly what needs to happen. But the other part of it is honesty.
Yeah. Friends, we're gonna be wrapping up in just a few minutes. Todd, I see your hand up, and I see a couple more hands. I'd like to suggest that we're gonna maybe end at 8:05. If those of you who want to stay, those of you who won't, we understand. Per popular request, those of you of New Shul, write to Misha. Those of you of Lab Shul, write to me. We can continue this. There's certainly going to be opportunities to come back together, not only on Zoom, to think of the days and months ahead of more learning and more activism. And we'll share some of those links later on. But I want to give the space, Todd, for a quick question, and maybe we'll wrap with that if we'll see.
So I don't know if everybody has seen the videos of, the Israeli Jewish protesters being attacked with stun guns and water cannons by the police. I mean, I think if you haven't, you can see people screaming, running. So, I think it's one thing to protest peacefully and another to protest when there's a much higher risk of personal consequences. And I'm just wondering whether you feel that on these issues and also more generally in the similar anti-democratic issues we're seeing in the US, that we should be considering, types of protests that, that could have personal consequences. Yeah, that's the question.
Yes, I think we should.
Sure. Yeah, Misha, go ahead.
The short answer is yes, and they are in Israel. They and Palestine, they're getting arrested. They're being shot at with these with the stun grenades and the machtazit, these stink bomb kind of water stuff that's being, they are taking these risks, and the longtime activists over there have been my dad's been arrested many times, and so I don't know what happens, honestly, when there's suddenly a lot of people who are willing to endure consequences. And I can tell you that for Amichai and me, we think very carefully about what we say and what we don't say, and how we can present this and how we can present that, and we are aware of consequences that may take place, of a variety of sorts, and we think also about, for me, what I've been thinking about recently is, before I post something or say something or invite people to a Zoom like this, in which I'm going to blabber on about my opinions, I'm also concerned that it could mess with my ability to enter Israel and see my brothers and sisters and parents, and my parents are getting old. These things are really not that far off. So not to say that we're brave and do everything we want to be doing. We're probably not. We could be doing more, but I think each one of us needs to kind of step a little bit beyond the comfort zone.
Yeah. Thank you, Misha. So folks, I think that's a good place to not stop, but pause. The points in the chat, which is extremely important, are about the global moment that we're in, from here in the United States to Eastern Europe to Russia, China. What is democracy? What is government? What is liberal and neoliberal? And to the beginning century, the beginning of the 21st century, those are the questions. The Jewish question is thousands of years old about being a democracy and a Jewish authority. And how do we walk our talk of remembering again and again, as the Torah reminds us, we were strangers, we were minorities, we were others. How do we translate that into the equity and dignity and liberty that all Jews demand and all humans demand, and that the state of Israel needs to figure out? And that is what is at stake here. Not Bibi's corruption. The judicial reform is an excuse for a power grab, and more people in Israel are understanding that and are rising. This is at the beginning. It's been only 6 weeks. The numbers are growing. The protests are growing. This conversation is one of many. And we want to end here. Maybe we'll take a few more seconds for just pausing, to take a breath, to appreciate being here together, for caring about what matters. I'll say one more word and hand it over to Misha to close. I remember years and years ago, after a particularly raucous Purim, where I was completely drunk and dragged and the whole thing. And the day after, I was just like such a low. And someone said to me, duh, every high is a low. After Purim comes the real introspection of who am I and how far did I go and what matters. And that brings you to Passover. And from the full moon of Purim to the full moon of Passover, we do bi'ur chametz. We start cleansing what we don't need, our spring cleaning, the crumbs that are clogging our system get removed, and truth towards the liberation of Passover is what we're focusing on. So tonight we're beginning with truth telling, and this is what tonight is about. We'll be doing so in the weeks and months ahead.
Amen.
Misha.
I'll also say, Purim is the holiday of things getting flipped upside down. And it tells us two things. It tells us we got to be in there in the deep horror. And we also have to keep a happy face and remember that these things, these conversations, they kind of want to make you go and dive into a wall or something. But we must carry ourselves and carry this question with a certain degree of levity, actually, even levity. And remember, and part of that is that these things do get flipped upside down. I when I came on, I'm wearing a Purim costume. What's my Purim costume? You see this little kippah? Yeah, who wears the smallest kippahs, who the person I know who wears the smallest kippahs who I've seen is Naftali Bennett. He wears tiny little kippahs, right? The previous prime minister, who I kind of despised most of his political career. But then he became this kind of hero when he put together this crazy government before. And so, we also have to remember that things can flip around. And that really is part of our existence and part of our work.
Amen.
Toda rabba.
In the long game.
Amichai, toda. Thank you, everybody. Wonderful spending this time with you.
Have a good night. Post Purim Sameach, to be continued. Thanks and good night, Misha.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, everybody. This was important.
To be continued. Thank you, Ellen. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.